You're listening to Doing Time, Talking Crime, a podcast that showcases the research currently being conducted at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Crime, Security and Law in Freiburg, Germany. My name is Christopher Murphy, and I'll be sitting down with researchers to talk about their projects, the various methods they use, and how their findings have impacted legal, criminological and psychological research in Germany and abroad. All this and more on Doing Time, Talking Crime. Well, welcome back to another episode of Doing Time, Talking Crime, the podcast that discusses the research being conducted at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Crime, Security and Law. Criminal victimization is a pervasive issue that transcends geographical, socioeconomic and cultural boundaries. Whether it's the trauma resulting from violent assault, the financial strain caused by identity theft, or the emotional toll of cyberbullying, the effects of victimization can be serious and long-lasting. What is clear, however, is that crimes affect victims differently. After the initial shock fades, some victims become stronger and more resilient, whereas others will continue to suffer. On today's episode, we're going to be looking more closely at how victims react to crimes and what can be done to improve their short and long-term well-being. Of course, before this can be done, we need to first understand how victims respond to victimization. And to do this, we need a clever research design. To tell us more about the above, I'm very pleased to be joined today by Florian Kaiser. Florian is a postdoc in the Department of Criminology and is definitely one of the most down-to-earth researchers I've gotten to know. Florian, welcome to Doing Time, Talking Crime.
Hi, Chris. It's really nice to be here.
Brilliant. No, thank you for taking the time to be here today. We've got a lot to discuss, so I'm going to get right to it. But before we talk about the results you found, about how crime affects victims, I'd like to learn a little bit more about how you conduct such studies in the first place. Can you maybe give us a rundown of that?
Yeah. I think it's really important to think about that because obviously we will have only high quality answers in a way for this important topic if we do it properly in a way. And there are different designs that can be used. And I think the major distinction is between qualitative studies and quantitative studies. Qualitative studies are basically very open-ended interviews, so there is not very standardized way, or the researchers typically have not questions that have to be answered one by the other, but it's much more a flowing experience, like, for example, a podcast would be, so that people can ask questions all in between also the researchers.
So that someone's sitting down with a researcher and they're asking questions.
Yeah.
They flow on from one another the questions.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It's really very open-ended and it's really about the perspective of the victim here. Okay. So really learn something about that. And it's very explorative also in that sense. What is also in the end maybe a problem on the other hand, I mean, it has its strength because we can explore topics that the researcher may have never thought about before that. But on the other hand, also obviously there is no standardization, or it's very difficult to standardize that.
Okay,
and
that
so in a way,
interview could be different then.
Each interview could be different, and obviously the researchers try to code the answers then and try to standardize it a little bit. But it's not like that you. Yeah, it's not easy to compare the responses of the different victims that you interviewed, and in that sense, it's also always relatively difficult to test hypotheses with these kind of designs. I mean, they are really good in generating hypotheses, which can then be tested with the second, I think, large design that exists in the literature or that exists in research, and this is quantitative studies or quantitative designs. And these designs are much more standardized. So they are basically researchers think about scales that they develop, for example, about well-being, but also about the victimization experience. But they are in a way very strict. So the questions are very, very precise, and people can only answer on specific response scales that the researchers have thought about.
1 to 10 or 1 to 5, and then it's basically a survey in a way.
Exactly. It's mostly large-scale surveys, for example, that use quantitative designs. Could also be smaller surveys, but the idea is really to be able to standardize the responses that the victims give, but also in a way to have non-victims maybe that you also study that also give answers to these standardized guides, and then be able to compare victims and non-victims. I mean, you can also do this with a qualitative design, but I think it is, especially because you want to test hypotheses, you want to maybe compare victims with non-victims. so to get an idea how much they suffer from their victimization. And so basically these, I think, are the broad two designs that exist.
That's right. I mean, there are definitely two designs that I've heard of in my time doing podcasts for Max Planck. Though I'm guessing I've got you on the show because you're doing something else, right? You're not just doing qualitative and quantitative. There's also other ways to go about studying victimization.
I think much more ways. This is a very broad distinction also, and I think generally studies are somewhere on the line between qualitative and quantitative. You can also use mixed designs, but you can also use in quantitative studies, you can also use open-ended questions, for example, so that victims can give much more their input into the survey also. But so this is, I think, a very broad distinction, and it's research generally is much more nuanced in a way. But I think what is really also important is to think about other features of the design that transcend, basically, I would say, qualitative and quantitative studies. And one thing that is really important in victimization research and on all the research that deals with how stressors affect people, it's to think about the temporal design of the study. For example, if you ask people just one time and the survey is just one time in the life of the people, then you can only ask them retrospectively about their experience, about their victimization experience or about their experience with other stressors. And then, for example, compare victims and non-victims who have been interviewed this one time with each other. And this may be very limited in a sense when you just interview people once, because then you don't know if they have not already differed before they experienced the crime. So that's really a problem, because then you can attribute, for example, the difference in well-being.
So you can't say that the difference in well-being was to do with the crime itself. This could be another factor entirely. Right, is that correct?
Yeah, that's the case. That's what I wanted to refer to, because it's really then the case that people may have, for example, victims in general have experienced much more stressors before, have much lower life well-being before they do the survey. And then we can attribute the experience, the victimization experience, to the crime. But it could be that it's previous stressors in life that, for example, are responsible for that. And this is why it's so important not to do these cross-sectional studies only. That's how they are called. When you interview people just once in their life, or once in the project at least. But it's really important to interview them repeatedly. And this is what panel designs do. They ask people again and again about their well-being, about their victimization experiences. And in this sense, you can, for example, compare then individuals who get victimized over the period of the surveys, of the project, of the repeated interviews, and compare them with individuals that do not become victimized and that, for example, have relatively similar levels of well-being before they become victims. So,
okay, so panel design could be a qualitative or quantitative. Within that, we have other ways of doing these two studies.
Yeah, I would say it's basically the temporal dimension is a design feature. I mean, and there are a lot more features we could think of, but I think that's the crucial ones that I want to mention here at the beginning, because that's also when I want to talk more about our research. I think that's the most important ones, also to understand. Yeah, that it's important to have these repeated interviews. I think that's a case I want to make also.
That's right. Well, let me stop you there, and I'll ask you exactly what approach have you taken in your research?
Yeah, we have used the panel design, so we have interviewed people repeatedly. We did that in Essen and Cologne, had a large community survey there. We sampled in the way adults. In the first step, we chose some neighborhoods, about 140, oversampled a little bit disadvantaged neighborhoods. Within these neighborhoods, we asked then random people. We sent mails to random people with the interviews, with the questionnaires in it, and asked them to participate. We did that first, for example, with basically two surveys, one in 2014 and 15, one in 20 and 2021. Okay. In 2014, for example, we asked people for the first time in spring 2014, asked them also if they were willing, if they participated, to take part again 1.5 years later in autumn 2015.
Okay, thereby creating the temporal element, so to say.
Yeah, definitely. And so we knew, we asked them, for example, in 2015 then, have you become a victim of different crime types since the first interview? And we had measured, obviously, in the first interview, their well-being by different questions. And so we could, for example, then compare individuals with very similar well-being scores that became victims and that were not victimized. And so we could compare them and how their well-being changed over time. And I think that's a smart thing and the important thing to do in this kind of research, because you need to compare people over time. and compare very similar people at best that have very similar baseline levels in terms of well-being. And yeah, that's how we conducted our study. And we did a replica survey then in 2020 and 2021. That was just 1 year, started in 2020 in autumn. And then we asked people again in 2021, also in autumn. So there was a little bit less of a time gap there.
Okay, a replica study is with the same study, but with a different cohort or group of individuals being asked.
Yeah, we basically used the same design, but we randomly sampled different people, but in the same neighborhood. So it could be that because some people still lived in the same neighborhoods, that they would be part again in our survey, but we don't know about that. So it was also not our intention to have the individuals from 2014-15 participating again, but it was really about having the same neighborhoods in the sample, because the leader of our research group is really interested in these neighborhoods. And so this is why he wanted to conduct a replica study. But on the individual level, on the questions about the consequence of victimization, it's really basically two different surveys, I would say, where it's not so important that it's the same neighborhoods.
Okay, right. One thing that kind of springs to mind there, you say you sent them a letter. I don't get much post these days. Usually it's a phone call or an email. But I'm wondering, so someone gets a letter out of the blue, maybe unwanted, unexpected, uninvited. There's got to be so many factors that play into whether they're actually going to respond, right? I mean, their language skills, their available time, their economic background, their trust of a research institution with a very long name. Also, whether they've already previously been a victim and maybe don't want to talk about their experience. How do you then kind of account for these, I guess, socio-economic realities, if you will, that the people who probably most likely to respond to your survey are not necessarily those who have been victimized the most?
I think it's a great question, and one where social scientists generally struggle with. It's really a challenge in the research. And you are totally correct. Typically, respondents get a letter out of the blue, and then we ask them to participate. And obviously, some people that have not the language skills or that don't have the time, that they won't answer, and that will be different people from those that participate in the end. That's a huge problem in a way. Yeah, I think that there are multiple solutions to that. On the one hand, we can try to keep people in the sample or get them participating by really being putting much effort into the sampling process. And for example, one could be to incentivize them, to give them money for participating, so that we get, for example, maybe some people into the sample that just do it for the money, that otherwise wouldn't participate. That's an option. And
okay, but they're not necessarily the people you want in the sample, or are they? You don't know.
I think, yeah, we never know. I mean, we try to, in a way, sample in a way that we get a representative sample in terms of the population. But yeah, sometimes it's really those that are deprived, that are poor, that live in disadvantaged areas that do not participate. And for example, giving them money may be an incentive. We don't know. I mean, we know, for example, a colleague of mine has done some research on that incentives, I think, work a little bit, and that the participation rate increases.
That would be an interesting question, right? Because I mean, I go and donate blood every now and then. There's a thing, how did you hear about us? And, you know, like from friends, from I get paid, or you know, I've been here before. Or that's not a question though that you put on why are you filling out this survey. That's not a standard question.
We haven't done that, but I think it's a really good idea. And there's also some methodological research more that tries to deal with non-response and with that people drop out and over time in studies. And they really recommend to put some of these questions into the survey to get a feeling why people drop out. Yeah, get to know your
audience, I suppose, in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we haven't done that because our research was very, very content. It was much about the content. It was not so much a methodological research. I mean, we had some parts of it where we tried to figure out something, but I think we don't have the question in it. I mean, we have a large questionnaire. I think overall, it is a good idea, but still, I mean, it wouldn't solve the problem in itself, obviously. I think what we could do is, on the one hand, also using some sampling techniques that could help that. For example, if we know that some groups, and we know that from research, won't participate as likely, for example, people that have language skill issues or are disadvantaged, don't have the time, we could, for example, oversample disadvantaged areas. And this is, for example, also what I mentioned, what we did in our project a little bit. We, in the end, decided to sample more disadvantaged neighborhoods than advantaged
And when you
neighborhoods.
say, as you give out more letters, you send more letters there to those neighborhoods than other neighborhoods in the hope that of the 100 letters that you send out, 20 stick, kind of.
Yeah,
and they get filled out, right?
And so exactly. And if you oversample a group, you get more people that respond in the end. And so the reflection of the population may be more likely as it should be.
So you're not kind of extrapolating the results, but rather you're sending out more at the very beginning. Okay.
It could be an option. And again, we did it a little bit by oversampling disadvantaged neighborhoods. And this way got a little bit more responses also from individuals that otherwise wouldn't have maybe participated, or that a little bit fewer people would be in the study at least.
Okay, understood. Did you want to say anything more about victims themselves, or you don't have to?
I just want to say that the sampling thing is just one thing that you could do. I mean, there's also that you can post hoc statistically sometimes also deal with these kinds of non-responses. And that's also just, I want to mention that as an option, because that's maybe the easiest way. Sometimes it's not always that it works, but you could, in a way, calculate scale factors for each individual that participated in the end. If you have population statistics and sample statistics, you can compare them. And this way, you can, for example, give people that are underrepresented higher scaling factors, called also weights. And this is why these strategies or techniques are also called weighting procedures. And in a way, you give them different scaling factors, and they contribute to a different amount to the analysis you do later and to the estimates you try to conduct. For example, if you want to estimate the prevalence of a specific victimization experience, then people will this way contribute differently to the analyses, to your estimates. And in this sense, you can try to wiggle a little bit with the data that you have and try to get more reflective finding for the population
Squeeze more
in the
out
end.
of the data you have.
Okay.
Exactly. Well, before we move off into too much mathematics, though, I'm going to haul you back in, and that's not my forte. I wanted to ask, I mean, we've kind of talking about now with the study design. I'd like to now ask what crimes you're actually looking at, and what forms of crime have historically been of interest to criminologists. I'm thinking on the one hand, kind of violent crime, murder, assault, rape, and non-violent crime, let's say, so theft, vandalism, fraud. I mean, these are obviously going to have different impacts on people's lives. What has criminology historically primarily been interested in, and what are you interested in your study?
Historically, I think that most research, when I look at that, at least especially panel research, but also cross-sectional research, was focusing on serious violent crimes. So there was a lot of research about rape, but also aggravated assault. So very, very serious offenses. And I think partly that is because we expect that people would suffer most from these experiences. And so it's really important for research to focus also on these crimes. Part of it was also because I think the victim movement in the 60s and also going on in the 70s, they were really interested also in helping people that experience these very serious crimes. And this was also why there was much more funding then, for example, for studying rape victims and the consequences of these crimes. I think more recently there was also more and more critique on this one-sidedness in a way of research. More and more scholars noted that it's also really important to study more minor crimes, be it verbal threats, for example, that have not this physical component, but also be it property crimes like vandalism, theft. And even if these are much more minor, maybe in a sense, when you see it from the outside perspective, but they can still lead to very severe consequences for some victims.
That's right. And obviously they're probably more frequent as well.
They are much more frequent, exactly. And this is also how they are really important then for society in general, because they may undermine, for example, also people's sense of safety. And if this happens in a large scale, I think this has huge societal implications. So I agree, it's very important. And this is also the line, I think, that more and more research is taking, that tries to get a little bit a broader perspective on crimes and study not only specific types, but also cross the boundaries.
Okay. For your study, you did both serious and or violent and non-violent crime, is that correct?
Yeah. We asked people basically about 7 different types of crime, or we asked them 6-7 questions about different offenses, and they were partly violent offenses and partly property offenses. For example, we asked them about verbal threats also, but also about sexual assault and physical assault, so also these more severe offenses in a way. But also a lot of property offenses like burglary, also one of the most severe ones in this category, but also vandalism, theft, consumer fraud. So in this way, we went a little bit also beyond previous research in that we try to explore different types of victimization and the consequences of them.
Okay. Would you say that that's what kind of set your study apart then from previous studies on the topic?
I would say, that is a part that is really important to our study. And I think in this way we address at least partially some of the concerns of previous researchers. But still, I mean, even here we have still broad categories, because just thinking about physical assault could reach from simple assaults in a way. For example, a fight in a bar where basically both people are similarly involved and there are not much injury. So it could be much more these kinds of simple assaults, but could lead to very aggravated assaults. So it's a strong range there within these crime categories. And that's important, I think, to keep in mind. So in this sense, although we extend previous research, I think we are still limited within these crime categories. And that's often the case with quantitative studies, because they are so standardized and you cannot ask people about every detail of the crime experience. This is where qualitative studies often shine, because they can
dig deeper, you can pose questions based on answers.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a huge advantage. And I think it's really also important to keep in mind for later, when I talk a little bit more about the results probably, that these categories are then driven by the more minor crimes within this category, because these will be the more prevalent crimes. Simple assault is happening more often than aggravated, very serious types of assault, for example. And so if we study these all into one category, our results in the end will be driven by the more prevalent and more minor crimes. And that's really important. I think that when I talk later about the results, that people have that in mind, because maybe we will underestimate, for example, effects of the more serious crimes, or we won't detect them because they are mingled in the crime categories that are relatively broad. Okay,
so from what you're saying there, Florian, there's obviously plenty of studies that have looked at victimization. What about at our institute as well? I mean, there's clearly, you're not the first. I probably like to think you're a pioneer in certain things, but there are other academics who've also been working on this. Do you want to talk a little bit about what those studies have looked like so far?
Yeah, I think there's a multitude of different projects that have worked on victimization and different scholars. And I think where our research is maybe a little bit different is that it concentrates on the consequences alone. And it does so with a panel design that's relatively rare. But otherwise, we have, for example, had a lot of cross-sectional research also. I just want to name 2 projects that I think are interesting there. There's, on the one hand, the work of Michael Kirchling at our institute, that he's really concentrating on the victim interests also after the crime happened and after it was recorded, for example, to the police. Why was it recorded to the police? How were people feeling within the justice system process? So this is really a different perspective on the matter. And I think a really important one also in the victimology area. Yeah,
certainly. He came on the show, and I think his episode is the one that's been most listened to of all time.
Cool. And I think also recently that's another option to listen a little bit more about what he has to say about that. Is he's also in the ARD Mediathek right now. He gave an interview there that's also interesting. It's more general also about victimology. I think these are 2 great sources to get a little bit know more about his topic and about victims also in the criminal justice system and how it's for them, how people react to crimes in the system also. The leader of our research group has collaborated with other people on the German National Victimization Survey on an earlier version. In 2020 there was the most recent one, but there were earlier ones, and he was partly contributing there. And these surveys are generally much more about finding out the prevalence and incidence of different types of criminal victimizations.
But not so much the knock-on effects.
Yeah, definitely. It's really much more descriptive in a way to describe who is also at risk of becoming victims of different types. So it's basically maybe complementary to what we are doing. now. And I think it's really important because, as I mentioned before, that some victims may be also a subpopulation of the general population that may also suffer other stressors before.
That's right.
And so they may differ in some aspects from people who do not become victimized, because we know that criminal victimization is not randomly distributed in the population. So just some people just have a higher risk of becoming victim than others. And this is basically where you can get deeper into this topic when you read about these German national victimization surveys and their results. I think that's a good source there. Right now, we have some research also very similar to ours on the consequence of victimization that also uses panel research, but they study children and adolescents. So they study a different developmental period. And this is basically done by my colleague Sebastian Kübel and also by our director Jean-Louis van Gelder. I think that's really interesting research also. It's basically if victimization influences people's further criminal behavior and also their impulsivity. So what are the detrimental effects on their behavior?
Okay. And right. And also not solely looking at their well-being, but also how they're actually behaving afterwards and whether they're inclined to also perhaps commit more crime if they fall victim to a crime.
That's what it's about. And I think it's also a little bit complementary. But I think on the other hand, it's also important to note that studying, I think, children or adolescents does not necessarily mean that we can transfer the results to adults. At least that is what some research shows, that in adolescence or also childhood, people are more susceptible maybe to external influences, be it parenting or be it peers, but also could be some stressors like victimization. And we don't know that. I mean, it could be that the results also are very similar. Right now, we don't know that.
That's why you're researching, to find out. Yeah. Well, you've definitely got me very intrigued to find out more about the results of your study. So don't go away. To our listeners, we'll be back after this short break to talk more with Florian. You're listening to Doing Time, Talking Crime, a podcast by the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Crime, Security and Law. Well, welcome back to Doing Time, Talking Crime. I'm joined in the studio today by Florian Kaiser from the Department of Criminology. Florian, before the break, we talked a lot about study designs, the design of your study, the design of other studies at the Institute. Really important and very fundamental to understand the results of your research. So I'd now like to, move to look more at how the well-being of victims is affected over the long and short term by crime and based upon your findings, I guess.
I think it's important that we also define well-being in a way. Maybe I should have done that before, but I think it's really important also to understand the results. And for example, I follow now a definition of well-being that is called subjective well-being, the concept. And this was introduced by Ed Diener, one of the very famous researchers on well-being and happiness. And he distinguishes between two types of dimensions that are important for well-being, and that's the cognitive dimension and the affective dimension. And the cognitive dimension is something about how we evaluate our life in general. It's a very cognitive idea that people think about their lives and how satisfied they are with them. So basically we ask people, how satisfied are you with your life in general? Okay. That's a question, and then people can answer from not at all to...
Right, I see. I jumped the gun there. Thank you for filling me in with that. Exactly, we need to define well-being first. That's right. It's true. It's one of those concepts you probably always think, I feel good, I feel happy. But do you? I don't know. On a scale of 1 to 10, I'm not sure. So yes, okay, so you've defined well-being for us, or the definition you're using.
I just wanted to extend a little bit on that, because that's a cognitive dimension, and this is life satisfaction basically, as I mentioned, but there's also this the affective dimension, and this is much more about emotions, so about moods also. It's there we ask people, for example, how much times they have been fearful, have felt anxiety during the past 2 weeks, for example, or how much they enjoyed life during the past weeks, how much they were excited about stuff. So this is much more about emotions then, and these two parts play together to they combine basically for the well-being.
To define that concept of well-being, right. Okay, so now that we've got a solid definition of well-being, what do the results of your study show concerning the effect of victimization on well-being?
I think they align quite well with some of the earlier research, I mean, there are also some difference, but overall, I think we can learn a lot about also previous research from our study. And the main study I want to talk about was published in 2021 by colleagues of mine, Helene Jansen, Dietrich Oberwittler and Göran Köber.
That's using the data that was gathered during this study.
Yeah. The data from Essen and Cologne, exactly. And basically they had 4 major findings, I would say. It was one that they did not really found global effects on well-being. So what I mean by global effects, that there was no effect on life satisfactions or emotions of the victimizations. They distinguished between property and violent crimes, so very broad. So they, in a way, aggregated the types of victimization that we talked about earlier.
And you're saying that they didn't find an effect?
They didn't find an effect on these well-being measures, and this is
fascinating.
Also, it's fascinating. It's also a little bit contrasting with prior research, but we will come, I think, later to it, why that may be the case. Or I can tell a little bit more later about that maybe also. But for them, for example, it was that they didn't found anything there. But, and that's, I think, important to mention, they found some more substantial effects on fear of crime. So a very crime-specific part of well-being, I would say. Right. And so there were some effects, but only on very specific emotions and cognitions.
So it didn't necessarily affect overall well-being, but in certain areas or certain specifically relating to certain topics or certain crimes, there was a fear. Okay, and that was an increase then?
There was an increase after the victimization. And it was particularly the case with repeat violent victimization, not so much, for example, with property crimes. So it was really more restricted, the substantial effects to these repeated victims. And mostly also to victims, and I think that's also interesting, that were victimized in their neighborhood and not so much of victims who were victimized somewhere else.
I wonder if that's because they are often reminded of the victimization then if it happens in their neighborhood, their surroundings.
Yeah.
I'm just postulating, obviously, but whether they're confronted with it more often.
Yeah, definitely could be the case. We don't know for sure because we don't know the mechanism in a way, or we don't know why this is the case. It's also threatening their life maybe much more where it takes part most of their day. And I think this could be explanations. We cannot be sure about that. I think that's where future research also has to dig a little bit deeper. People should also ask more questions maybe about these crimes in the neighborhood. Yeah, I mean, these are basically the main results, and there are 2 other results, but that are crucial, I also think. On the one hand, it is the case, and this is what I mentioned earlier, that people, even if victimization itself had not much of an effect, that victims already were much more dissatisfied with life, had more negative emotions before the crimes. It seems that victims are, in a way, more unhappy before they become victims already. And afterwards, the one-time victimization, for example, has not so much of an impact then. But still, they seem to suffer in a way, but they do that already before. And it may be that there's a lot of stress already going on before they become victims in their lives. But again, that's speculation in a way.
Okay, and there was one other point you wanted to raise?
We studied also people that became victim before the first interview, but then has not become re-victimized between the 2 interview waves. And these victims, their fear of crime diminished over time. And that's because they recovered when there was a time where they did not become victimized again. So the victimization for them is really a relatively long time ago, and their fear diminishes over time. And it's speculation, but it seems reasonable that they recover. And previous research also shows that after a few months, or mostly at least after a year, people are really well recovered in terms of their well-being also after crime.
I guess you've already raised some of the questions I wanted to ask you about now, and you've raised answers to them, and that is why I guess certain people are so resilient to crime, or they get knocked down and they stand back up again. And then we have others who will suffer tremendously. And this could even be from the same crime, I guess. These are often individual factors that may not actually have anything to do with the crime per se, but maybe with the life even before the crime.
It's definitely a possibility. I mean, that's, for example, where research is, I think, in flux, where we need more research on these variation also in crime reactions. I would say, definitely part of it is that people have different coping strategies, for example, and this is why they recover faster or less fast. For some, the victimization experience will have permanent effects on their lives. Also, what you mentioned, I think it's in our case here, for example, also, and this is that we have these more minor crimes that drive our findings, because most people in our study are, for example, in the property crime dimension, experienced vandalism or theft. And I mean, even if these crimes are obviously can be very detrimental to people's well-being, most people, I think, will recover quite quickly. And this is because we ask them about the crimes they experienced in the last 1.5 years. We don't pick up on short-term effects that may be still there. So we would expect stronger effects if we would ask them directly after the crime.
Yes.
And we just don't find them probably because we don't have...
You probably get a few of them in your study, but no, of course, you obviously can't because the time frame you're using, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
It's about our measurement. And I think, and that's also maybe something we have to do in the future. We have to think about using smaller time frames, studying people more often, not only twice and with such a big time gap between the interviews. I think that is really recommendable, but it is also really expensive and you get the funding. You need funding for that,
Yes.
but I think it would be crucial step also for this kind of research and especially also what you mentioned for the variation in the reactions because if we can study, for example, the types of crime in more nuances, this would be good. But also the reactions of the people. If we could study that in more detail and also when did they react, in which manner, I think that would be a crucial step forward. Yeah, maybe also coming back to your point, why some people may be so resilient. I mentioned that there are these coping strategies that people use, and I think that they are really helpful for them. And although they may sometimes not sound like that, for example, people use downward comparisons. I mean, we do that in life also with other stressors or with other things that happen to us.
What's an example of that?
That is, for example, if you think about counterfactual words, about words that didn't happen, for example, where you suffered even more from the crime. So you think, I'm doing quite well, like that. So really reinterpreting how you cope, for example, with the event.
As it could be far worse off or something like that, comparing it and making, But these are coping strategies that are innate in a way, right? I mean, or can they be learned?
I mean, there's also therapy that obviously try to work with people so that they relearn in a way the strategies that they use because some are really detrimental to them. But I think, most of them, the strategies are really innate. And I can give another example. I think that's really interesting and that can be bad for a person or can also be very good for recovery. And this is, for example, blaming oneself. I mean, there's literature on that you can distinguish two types of blaming yourself in a way for becoming the victim. And the one type is that you can say, this is all due to my character, how I am. I'm just not resilient. I'm just not cautious enough. I will never be. Like that you cannot change. There's the idea that you cannot change and that you attribute it to your character. Yes. On the other hand, you can also blame yourself for the offense specifically, only for the behavior in this specific crime that happened. And this is, for example, could be more helpful because then you could change your behavior and think about that you get some control back. Because one of the huge issues with victimization is that people lose their perception of control over their lives. And when you blame yourself for, I mean, it sounds strange, but when you blame yourself for victimization, on the other hand, you get control back because you think, I can change something in my life.
Yeah, certainly. No, it doesn't sound strange. I think it makes sense. That's right. You can take control of the situation again and avoid that happens again. Or certainly do your best to. Is it an oversimplification to say that more serious crimes lead to more suffering?
I think maybe a little bit, but I guess the literature in general indicates that violence has more detrimental effects on people's well-being, on victims' well-being. So that is the case. But I mentioned that we study these relatively broad categories most of the time, and research is doing that. We don't ask much questions about the crime events specifically, so about injuries, for example, about how many offenders have been weapons involved. There is some research, but mostly not panel research. So it's mostly cross-sectional, and we know that there are some problems to really attribute then the effects to the crime. And so in the end, I think the research so far points into this direction, that violent crimes have more substantial effects and that the most serious forms of violence have the most detrimental impacts and the most long-lasting. But unfortunately, we are not quite there to really say it with certainty. What are the crime features that really trigger, in a way, long-term consequences, long-term decline in well-being and
And I guess that's right. There's the, what do they say, low-frequency, high-impact events, but that doesn't mean we should put it under the carpet, the maybe low-impact but high-frequency events. As you say, they can still have a major effect on your well-being if you keep falling victim even to theft or burglary or threats.
Yeah.
I mean, we've talked now, you've told us a lot about the person-specific or victim-specific coping strategies. What about the role of the environment? I guess not thinking about trees and birds, but more about the environment in which you live in. Is it likely that if you are in a more disadvantaged environment that your overall feeling of well-being will be lower?
Yeah, definitely. That's also one of the last or most recent studies that we conducted, because I mean we have this focus also on neighborhoods in our project, and it was one of the questions that we ask ourselves: do people in specific neighborhoods suffer more if they become victims? This is indeed what we found. We found that people that live in more deprived and more disadvantaged areas, economically, but also in terms of social issues, that these individuals will suffer more from a victimization. We measured that here by that their fear of re-victimization that increased much more strongly. And for people who lived in more advantaged areas, with more affluent areas, this was not the case. There was not really an increase in fear of crime.
I guess that's kind of interesting. The cities you cover, was it Cologne and Essen?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they're very big and broad makeup there, and you would have disadvantaged neighborhoods as well as affluent neighborhoods. Yeah. And so, and that's exactly what you were able to test now and find out that this does have an impact.
Yeah. Definitely. I think it's really, really important to show that, and maybe it goes also with what I said before, that, and this was our interpretation also, that some people may just have so much stressors going on in their lives, and this will probably be people who live in more disadvantaged areas. They will have stressors also due to their environment they live in, and so on. And I think that this will make it much more difficult to deal with additional stressors. That's at least
when you're already kind of at boiling point, and then something else happens on top that it just it makes it all the more difficult to come back. I think I've read about is it cumulative disadvantage? Is that what you're talking about there? That it's where it gets to breaking point, I guess, and your breaking point is maybe far lower than someone else's.
Yeah. That's exactly what the researchers also called it. It's cumulative disadvantage. See this, like you mentioned it. It's this idea that violence begets violence, and or stressor begets stressor. And at some point you are overwhelmed with stressors, and they will have a more detrimental effect on your life. And no matter what, I think it's in itself, it's a really interesting and important finding that people that are already in a bad position, I would say, that they will probably suffer more. That's
right, yeah. Well, I always try to finish the podcast on a note of what can be done in the future, I guess. And we've heard now that about well-being, about the effects of crime, about the effects of neighborhood, effects of the environment you grow up in, the severity of the crime, the frequency. What if we kind of boil it all down now, get the essence that we can present to a policymaker and say, yo, Mr. Policy, probably wouldn't say yo, dear Mr. Policymaker, we've got these findings here. This is, we've prepared it for you. It's on a platter now. Put this into effect. What could make the situation better?
Especially when we look at the last finding that I presented, it's really about this idea to battling or to fighting poverty, disadvantage, that people have a lot of stressors in their life, and that even before the victimization, because as I mentioned, when the victimization happens afterwards, the consequences will be more dire if people already probably live in environments that contain much more stressors. So it's really, I think, combating more these previous stressors or these more continuous stressors people have in life. And I'm honestly no expert there. So it's really, I think in the end, it's really crucial that policymakers also try to combat these disadvantages. And I think one of the things that happened recently that can provide something there is that the government, for example, decided to increase their funding for schools in disadvantaged areas. This is just one of the things I think that can contribute it, because then people will have better education. This may reduce stress, even if it's just on the work related outcomes that they have later in life. But this can help already, as I mentioned. And I think that's the way to go. And also, at best, obviously, to reduce inequalities, economic, social inequalities, because they will all contribute to disadvantaged poverty in a way, and make it more likely that some people suffer very severely from victimization, but I also think other stressors. in the end, I think, as I mentioned, I am not expert. I'm not an expert on that.
No, but I was like to get an idea of what because it's great to have the research there, but I'm thinking we do the research for a reason, and that's how can we bring about good and more well-being in this world? I guess that's right. I think it's an interesting way to think about it because I think so much focus is put on preventing crime, whereas this is looking at, saying a crime has occurred, but then how do we prevent the effects of the crime then? I mean, that's right. There's two sides of the coin to look at here. It's I think so much always gets put on the prevention of the crime itself, but rather about looking about, how do we mitigate the effects of the crime? So, Florian, thank you so much for coming onto the show today. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot, and I wish you all the very best with your research.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to today's program. If you would like to hear additional podcasts or learn more about our research, please visit our website at www.csl.mpg.de.